Welcome to General Admission, a podcast playing some tunes, talking about those songs, and making you more aware of music that you might have missed. I'm John Krutoff, your loudmouth host. This episode looks at punk songs about cars. Now, you might imagine that a show about cars might be North American focused, seeing as that's where the big, bulky car, macho, just, car focused really is in North America. Mostly in the States, but up here in Canada too. That's mostly true, but you'll see as I work through the set tonight that some of the songs are not from places that you think of. And in fact, the majority of the songs I'll play tonight are actually from England. So let's get some of the big, obvious ones out of the way. The ones that you probably go, it has the word car in the title, and it's about driving. Up first, Big Boys, Frat Car.
Tonight that we got the truck, we're going downtown, gonna beat up drunks. You're to the drive, I'll bring the beer. It's a late shift, no one to fear. And ride, how we ride. And ride, you ride. It's a roundup time with a good horse beat. We're gonna drive one screaming off the street. And ride, how we ride. Uniform and a silver badge. Play cops for real and play cops for pay. Let's ride, you ride. Your dress is a kick in the ass. Let's reach your balloon till you're shit in your pants. No move, child, got a big black stick. There's 6 of us, babe, so suck on my dick and ride, how we ride. Let's ride, you ride. The left newspapers might whine a bit, but the guys at the station, they don't give a shit. Dispatch calls, oh, you're doing something wicked. No siree, Jack, we're just giving tickets. Let's ride, how we ride. And ride, how we ride. And ride, how we ride. Let's ride,
a new song. It's about drinking and driving, so we call it Drinking and Driving. Drink! 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 Don't think! Drive! Kill! Get drunk online, work 40 hours a week! And half your time on the rush again week! Make sure to tell yourself that this is cool, and make sure to tell yourself that you have no choice. Make sure to tell yourself that they drive you to it, and that you can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time. You can quit. You can quit any time that you want. Drink, 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 drink. Don't think. Drive, kill. Party down, drink until you can't even see. Fill your car with your buddies and rapping around a tree. Be sure to tell yourself that this is cool, and make sure to tell yourself that you have no choice, and make sure to tell yourself that they drive you to it, and that you can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time. You can quit. You can quit any time that you want. Yeah! Oh! Make sure to tell yourself that this is cool, and make sure to tell yourself that you have no choice, and make sure to tell yourself that they drive you to it, and that you can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time. You can quit. You can quit any time that you want. Drink, 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 drink. Don't think. Drive, kill. Being a pretty penny lying low in a hospital bed. Bust your car, busted head, you had a fever, now he's dead. Make sure to tell yourself that this is cool, and make sure to tell yourself that you have no choice. Make sure to tell yourself that they drive you to it, and that you can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time that you want. You can quit any time. You can quit. You can quit any time that you want. Anytime you want. They can't make things worse for me. Sometimes I'd rather die. They can tell me lots of things, but I can't see eye to eye. I know they know the way I think. I know they always will. Someday I'm gonna change my mind. Sometimes I'd rather kill. Light stains, fake kills, fast cars, cheap grills, rich girls, fine wine. I lost my sense, I lost control, I lost my mind. Oh, things seem so much different now. The scene has died away. I haven't got a steady job, and I got no place to stay. Life's a futuristic modern world. Things aren't what they seem. Someday you better wake up from this stupid fantasy. Light stains, fake kills, fast cars, cheap grills, rich girls, fine wine. I lost my sense, I lost control, I lost my mind. Light stains, fake kills, fast cars, cheap grills, rich girls, fine wine. I lost my sense, I lost control, I lost my mind.
First up in that set off the 1980 Frat Cars 7-inch was Frat Cars by the Big Boys. Now, this band should need no introduction to you. if you're not aware of their greatness, though, sit yourself down with the 2 CD sets, the Skinny Elvis and the Fat Elvis, which are probably out there floating around on the internet, or if you happen to have a CD player. Does anyone even have those anymore? I mean, I do, but I'm old. So check those out. It's a worthwhile listen. Maybe not what you, if you're purely a hardcore fan, maybe not what you're into, but I think if you listen, you'll see this sort of broad scope of what a band can do, especially in the early 80s in punk. The 1980s Frat Cars 7-inch is really at the birth of hardcore, but still heavily influenced by that fuck you punk attitude. And it took a couple years for a lot of the Austin bands, maybe by 82, to really sort of embrace hardcore and play a faster, harder, louder kind of approach. The big boys were sort of never outside influence. They were always very much on their own, doing their own sort of thing, and entirely uncompromising, which means they often veered away from hardcore and punk to play funk, dub, quiet, introspective, what would later become post-punk, or stuff that might have fit in with what was coming out of 1985 DC Washington. Think, Embrace or Rites of Spring. And that's all on one album. So if that sounds like something that you'd be into, by all means, pick up the big boys. I think that they are probably the best out of that bunch of bands that were kind of doing that thing with pulling in multiple different sort of influences. Add in on top of that, the art that was designed for the covers was a cacophony of resources, little clipped art, things found by the singer Randy Biscuit Turner, and put together with some influence from Tim Kerr and Chris Gates. And you really have a band that is pushing boundaries on multiple levels, not just in their music, but on the art that they put out. One of my favorites for sure. Frat Cars, of course, being their first release, is sometimes bands suffer that their first release is their best work and everything else is diminishing returns from there on out. This is not the case. I think actually Fun Fun Fun, which came out in 82, shocking that I think something in 82 is somebody's best work, but I think Fun 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 is the best out of the bunch. Sort of, it gets that urgency of hardcore, but mixes in all the other different things going on with the big boys. Frat Cars is the Killed by Death style punk beginning. You can hear Biscuit's trademark drawl, and Frat Cars is really a framework for the band to work from over the next 4 or 5 years. Anyways, enough about them. After the big boys, I played Dead Kennedy's Police Truck, probably a song you know more than I do about. It's a very, very well-known song. It was actually the B-side to the Holiday in Cambodia single, and so imagine, picking that up in 1980 and going Holiday in Cambodia on side A, Police Truck on side B, both absolute classic songs. If you're of a certain vintage, you might have discovered Police Truck by playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater, or Guitar Hero if you're even younger. And there's some controversy about those licensing deals. Now, remember, this all happened during a lawsuit between East Bay Ray, D.H. Peligro, Klaus Fluoride, and on one side, and Jello Biafra and Alternative Tentacles on the other, about royalties that Jello had not, and Alternative Tentacles had not paid to the rest of the band on the Dead Kennedys back catalog. Apparently, Alternative Tentacles' lawyer signed off on the licensing agreement, but Jello did not. So it's kind of an interesting quasi-story. It's just one of the other complicated tales that the Dead Kennedys had long after they were dead. Long story short, the song ended up in the game and probably was welcome addition in comparison to the typical dreck of music in games at the time. The Holiday in Cambodia single was a massive independent success. Ironically, not on Alternative Tentacles, but on Cherry Red Records out of the UK. And it sat in the UK independent charts for over a year, 63 weeks. It never hit number 1, though. It only got to number 2. There's no real data on American sales and what would have been the import charts for 1980, so I'll leave it at that. After Dead Kennedys, I played Battalion of Saints AD with Hell's Around the Next Corner. Battalion of Saints are an underrated band. Again, another band that if you don't know, you should get into. Even the recent releases, or more recent releases as Battalion of Saints AD by them are really pretty good. Way better than you'd expect them to be. They're kind of in the same vein of what Poison Idea did in recent years. It's not, Feel the Darkness or the classic records, but it's still pretty damn good. I pulled Hell's Around the Next Corner off of the Death Are Us CD, which came out in 95 and should probably get a vinyl issue one of these days. It's a compilation of various releases and across the band's entire career, including when they were just Battalion of Saints. You probably know Second Coming, that's the classic, but don't sleep on the later stuff. The band has gone through actually quite a ton of tragedy, and doing some reading about them, from the death of the guitarist Chris Smith in 1987, after he was in Battalion of Saints and Kraut. He actually died with some mysterious circumstances around it. Some say it's an accidental overdose, some say it was more malicious, or somewhere in between. That question has never been succinctly answered. And then Barry, who was also one of many basses, overdosed. I guess live fast, die faster is the appropriate response. After that, it was Black Flag Drinking and Driving with a peculiar mix that permeated in my head. Well, I didn't really want to play the version off In My Head, so I played the version off of Who's Got the 10.5, which is a way better thing. I got the Who's Got the 10.5 cassette, I believe, in 1988. It was cheaper and had more songs than the LP, so I went with that route. This is before CDs were really a thing. Anyways, you probably know a little bit about Black Flag late period stuff. In My Head was actually supposed to be Ginn's first solo album, but stories say that Rollins convinced him to make it a Black Flag record. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it might explain the absolute atrocious mix that has Ginn's guitar basically shitting all over the rest of the band, and that's a real tragedy, because the songs on In My Head are actually kind of good. I mean, at the time they were widely disliked by a lot of the punk purists, but it certainly has its moments. I think Drinking and Driving actually is one of the shorter songs. Actually, is a little bit more to the taste of punks who would have, wanted to hear things off of Damaged and that sort of thing. Got to remember that this is now 5 years past that release, so there's a lot of history, let's say, between Damaged and In My Head. A little more about the song. There's also something else going on, and I wonder if it's about Ginn still figuring out if the band can still work together in his mind. Rollins gets credit and lyrical control of this one, which might explain why the lyrics are, frankly, kind of terrible. I'm frankly a lot surprised by the amount of respect this album gets on the internet. I did some browsing around, and everybody seems to have like a really hot takey review saying this is their best record. Like, are you fucking kidding me? There's no way in hell that this is their best record. Anyways, lastly, I played Agent Orange Bloodstains off the excellent 7-inch of the same name. And Bloodstains was, Agent Orange's calling card, literally. They sent a demo of it to Rodney on the Rock, which then got comped on the first Rodney on the Rock compilation in 1979. But scoring that sort of notoriety right off the hop really helped them get noticed. They were playing on major shows within months of that song hitting the air. Steve Soto was in that version of the band, who left shortly after the Bloodstained 7-inch came out to join, form, become part of the Adolescents, and frankly, I think the band subsequently missed his songwriting. They certainly weren't bad, but if you listen to the Adolescents' later records, they just never had that extra oomph.
Hello, Mom. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're welcome. A little intimate party tonight.
That's as started off with The Clash covering Vince Taylor and his Playboy's Brand New Cadillac off of the well-known London Calling double album. It was fairly well known that The Clash liked to warm up with the song, and lots of people claim it's one of the first British rock and roll songs. I don't know. I'm not an authoritarian on British rock and roll, but needless to say, The Clash recorded their version, put it on London Calling, and that was certainly the first time I heard the song, although if I look around, I can probably find other examples of it as well. And I can't say at the tender age of 14, I didn't really understand the difference between rockabilly and punk and anything else, really. And if The Clash even were a punk band, I mean, after all, they were on a major label, weren't they? I do know that Brand New Cadillac was a favorite of Joe Strummer, and it lasted in The Clash's sets up until the very last busking tour show in 1985 with the scab band that Joe assembled. Brand New Cadillac wasn't only important to the UK early punks, it was also important to the Canadian ones too, as it was a staple in Teenage Head set and made it onto their 1980 LP Frantic City. Speaking of Teenage Head, yeah, I'll take any chance to play the hometown band at any moment, so I played Top Down, not Brand New Cadillac. Now, Top Down was a bit of a hit on Canadian radio, not hugely massive, but as good a rock and roll song as Canadian radio can get. It first appeared as the opening track on the self-titled LP, which went through 2 mixes, 3 if you count the recent 40th anniversary remix, but was also cut as a single with yet again a different mix, unlabeled and really not out there. And that was released in 1979 by Epic Records. That version appeared on the Fun Comes Fast double LP anthology from 2018. Are you still hanging on here? Well, wait, there's more. The song was also on the 1984 live album, Live in an Endless Party, and featured on a single from that album too, yet slight different mixes. The single from that album, which was Top Down on the A side, Picture My Face was the inexplicable B side. All right, we're not done yet though. When the Other People's Music label reissued the first LP in 1996 on CD for the first time, they added some other songs. And wouldn't you know who scored the pony, Top Down was on that as well. This time from the LP sessions. I'm assuming it's the same recording as the 1979 single, but I don't have a copy of the CD, and I haven't actually seen one ever to the best of my knowledge. So to finish the thought, I assume it's the same recording as the 1979 single with a Chris Spedding mix. I do know that Chris Spedding remixed it. So, to finish the thought, with some clarity on Top Down, 7 different mixes, 5 different releases, 1 excellent song about cars. I played the live version from a 1978 Q107 radio broadcast that has been circulating on the internet, and I kind of like it better than any of the other versions that I've heard. I only have I have the Fun Comes Fast reissue, and I have the 2 different mixes of the first LP. And really, that's probably all you need if you're not into early Canadian punk. After Teenage Head, I played the Avengers Car Crash off the We Are the One 7-inch, which came out on Danger House in 1977, 78. Like Top Down, Car Crash has been featured on several of the Avengers releases since then, featured on 5 of the 10 official releases, which include 2 live albums and 5 EPs. So that's over half the official releases have a version of Car Crash on it. I mean, it's a good song and all, but maybe some of those reissue labels could, put something else on. It's almost as popular as Top Down was for Teenage Head. Nonetheless, the driving bass line of the song will be in your head for days and days and days. It's one of those things that I haven't heard it for a couple days as I'm recording this voiceover, and I know exactly what it sounds like when I, bring up the song. I did get a chance to see one of the Avengers reunion tours in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, as it came through Hamilton. And it was made mention at the show. Penelope at the show, I remember, made mention that there was some sort of connection to Hamilton from the original Avengers band. I don't remember what it was, and I wish I did, because, man, that makes this sort of improv piece of text less impressive. Anyways, as a guy who kind of hates the reunions as old people rehashing their youth in a way that makes no sense, I'd rather old people make their own music, new music. The reunion was not terrible by any means, and that was shocking to me, because I thought for sure this had a chance to be a really slow, urgent version of the Avengers, and it was quite palatable. So that's good. You should try and hunt down the original We Are the One on Danger House, as it's an important 7-inch on an important label, but definitely be prepared to part with your lunch money. And then some. those early Danger House records have become a pricey thing since eBay and in fact since the sort of explosion of information about punk rock records. It's a great one. If you can get it for around $100, snag it up because that's a good one to have in your collection. Lastly, I played Hot Cars by the Angry Samoans off the Inside My Brain LP. Maybe it's an EP. I don't know. It's a 12-inch. By 1980, the Angry Samoans had put out this record and alienated one of the biggest influencers of the LA scene in Rodney Bingenheimer by writing a song called Get Off the Air, which implored him to get off the air. While not entirely an unreasonable request from a punk, Rodney did use his influence to basically blacklist the band, so much so that the next release by the Angry Samoans went under the moniker Queer Pills. Again, that didn't really fool anyone, but nonetheless, you'll notice an absence of the Angry Samoans from places like the Whiskey A Go-Go. Certainly that was due to Rodney's influence. The first LP and the follow-up, Back from Samoa, are great records, and I guess some of them could be considered questionable content in a modern context, but I think they're not terrible. Like, again, we'll see more of this later, but it seems like maybe as I've gotten older, I've become a little more tolerant of sort of questionable content. Not to say that I'm going to be down with any sort of outright racist or sexist remarks, but I think in some of the contexts when you're trying to offend, you have to understand that sort of impetus. Anyways, I did mention the reunion thing with the Avengers, who did a half-decent one. Don't bother with seeing the modern Angry Samoans. They just flat out suck.
She's getting drunk, calling it out. You can see it inside my culture. And real right, just work a little fine. That's what you want. It's about your time, do it, but your girl, go do it. Do it tonight, my TV boy. Getting drunk, calling it out. You can see it inside my culture. And real right, just work a little fine. That's what you want. It's about your time, do it, but your girl, go
Teengenerate started the set with My GTO off the Savage 10-inch EP, which was on Sympathy for the Record Industry, if you remember that label. They were hugely prolific for about 15 minutes in the garage rock era of punk rock in the mid to late 90s. Teengenerate were certainly taking the garage rock inspired band trend of the 90s and blowing it out to 100,000,011. Totally blown out, fuzzy, distorted, but still you can hear the songs in there. And so that's an interesting kind of thing that I think just endears me to the whole genre or subgenre, I guess. My GTO is kind of a weird song because it was actually written by Andy Gortler of the Devil Dogs, and then sent to Teengenerate, well, as the story goes, on a cassette as a gift, and then Teengenerate recorded it, put it on the record, and played it live a bunch. And that sort of cassette became a bit of urban legend, and so Teengenerate in, I guess about 2014, got the cassette put on a compilation called I Don't Like Sex on King Records. So it took like 15 years or so to get that song, as it originally was played by the Devil Dogs, out. I tried hunting it down because I actually don't have that compilation. I don't have actually a lot of garage rock. A lot of it's in the digital form, but I don't have a lot of garage rock on record. And so, if anyone out there has it, feel free to point a link to it. It's got to be out there on YouTube somewhere. Anyways, the song actually got quite a bit of traction, and it got used in the 2000 film Wild Zero. Kind of cool. Teengenerate didn't ever really break up. They've still done shows and occasional appearances over the last, I want to say 25 years. But mostly Fifi and Frank spend their time in the tweezers and the radio. So if you like what you hear in Teengenerate, you might like what you hear in the tweezers and the radios. Next up was the Dwarves with Backseat of My Car off of Blood, Guts, and Pussy. And well, what is there to say about the Dwarves? Offensive rock and roll was a weird place in 1990, and the Dwarves were sort of front and center, playing rock and roll in an increasingly political punk scene, as well as having the rise of emo. It was a weird time. The 90s were a weird time. The Dwarves, in hindsight, weren't that controversial. If you look back at the stuff, some of the things they said and did were mildly offensive, but certainly it was just maybe in bad taste. They sure weren't highbrow art. Anyways, I don't know that Backseat of My Car is the best song on the 13-minute LP, but the whole thing is a barn burner of a record, and you blink and you miss it. Up next was Zero Boys Drive In off the History of LP, which was originally cassette and been reissued a couple times. Zero Boys wrote a perfect punk LP and then broke up. Well, okay, the band that performed on the perfect punk LP, Vicious Circle, didn't put out another record. However, the Zero Boys did. Just to be clear. Indiana did some wonderful things. I can't think of anything other than birthing the Zero Boys as my number one. And it should be your number one too. Well, maybe, you know what? I shouldn't say that. David Letterman's a pretty good number. A wonderful thing to come from Indiana as well. History of has appeared in a bunch of places and been reissued a bunch of times, but most recently reissued by Secretly Canadian. And they did a good job of making sure that reissue was also mixed and at a sufficient loudness that some of the other more unofficial bootleggy releases, those maybe didn't sound as good. So try and pick up the reissue by Secretly Canadian if you can. Channel 3 were last in that set, and maybe picking a song off their later period was not advised. I had heard this album probably about 20 years ago. And I remember the lead-off song, Indian Summer, and I thought it was like kind of catchy, punky, kind of not terrible. But certainly this song, Drive By, may not have been the best song. Anyways, the mid-'80s were a weird time too, much like the mid-'90s. You can certainly count the number of bands who ended up on semi-major labels trying to make it into the college rock sound that Spin and other independent magazines were into. You got to remember, some of these bands were 5 or 6 years old at this time, and they had been touring enough that they had a following, but much like Discharge going metal and DRI going more metal and COC going metal, some other bands went to the college rock sort of softer sound like 7 Seconds and Channel 3. Channel 3 gave it a go. Like I said, I think the lead-off song Indian Summer is better than Drive By, but I think Drive By has its own hooks and isn't as bad as it could have been. Could have been really bad. Having a backing track of voices talking through the song was a weird production move, and hey, kids, don't waver from your vision, or else you might end up like this. Now to cleanse the palate, some Buzzcocks.
motorbike in Africa is riding the white line, oblivious of snakes stretched out across the way like tripwire, shouting, "The road is mine." Facing the line of the skeleton coast, ghost riders from the southwest, the original angels of death they see, 6 motorbikes abreast. Riding through the oppressive night, now only the hardest remain. Look at my tracks, look at the bodies behind their backs, look at the bastards play in Africa today. Riding through the oppressive night, now only the hardest remain. Look at the scars of the tire tracks, look at the bodies behind their backs, look at the bastards spray in Africa today. The bodies of peacock, the Soweto of war, the Christian message of Dutch reform, the sound of the monster, the motorbike roar, the hate in the eyes of the uniform poor, the head and the bucket, the foot and the floor, racial torture and racial war in Africa today. The bodies of big up and so ways of war, the Christian message of Dutch reform, the sound of the truck. No protection on a motorbike. Sooner or later, the normal traffic's going to catch you.
Buzzcocks kicked off that set with Fast Cars off Another Music in a Different Kitchen. Probably the best bass line in punk, outside of some of the more reggae tracks out there, but even then I could be convinced that this is way better. Steve Diggle wrote the song about a car crash he was involved in. Not an unusual topic in early punk, as we've seen in other songs already, but some people believe it was written by Devoto and Shelley. Early pressings erroneously omitted Diggle's contribution, and later versions give all three credit. So, Steve Diggle claims he wrote the song in his biography, or his autobiography, I guess that would be the case. But all three get credit. Neat little side note. On September 19th, 1977, the Buzzcocks ended up opening their John Peel session with Fast Cars. And it really highlights the bass guitar and the playing. But I firmly actually believe, unlike in many other cases, that the LP version is better than the live version. So I played that. After the Buzzcocks, it was UK Subs. Again, another band you should probably know if you know anything about punk. And the song was I Live in a Car off of their first album, Another Kind of Blues. I think I Live in a Car might be among the most unheralded songs that the UK Subs did. Lots of people call it Warhead and any number of CID, any number of other songs, but I think I Live in a Car is 240 seconds of, pretty much perfection. Appearing as a B-side to the CID 7-inch in 1978, it topped the indie charts in November of that year. And it's funny because Another Kind of Blues went to number 21 in the LP charts. That's not the independent LP charts. That's the normal LP charts. This record has probably sold close to 200,000 copies. An amazing feat for an independent band. After the Subs, I played two songs by the Dutch band, The X. First was Human Car off of the 1980 LP, Disturbing Domestic Peace. Although Human Car appears on a bonus 7-inch called Live Skive, or Live Skive. So sound quality may suffer a titch. And after that was a Motorbike in Africa off the 1988 LP, Oral Gorilla. You can see, even in 8 years, how much the band had changed. Disturbing Domestic Peace was the X's first full-length in their 40 years of making music. I just ended up seeing them just last month, and they were fantastic, although not really anything like these two songs. They started off clearly as a punk band exploring what punk music could be, but the band has matured with each release. And maybe maturity is a bad word for you. I think it's a good thing in this context because they kind of move a little bit left, a little bit right off that sort of sound. And they end up in these sort of different tangents each time, and it reveals something interesting and new. Their career and Sonic Youth seem shockingly similar to my mind, and maybe you can... Well, give it a think and let me know what you think. So the X started out as a very abrasive punk band. The Disturbing Domestic Peace LP, very similar to the first couple of Sonic Youth records, which were still a band trying to figure out their place. By, for the X, it was about 8 years later. For Sonic Youth, it would be, 4 or 5 years later when they released Sister and New Day Rising. For the X, I believe Oral Gorilla was the first sort of full length that sort of marked the end of that initial exploratory punk phase and into the more independent, I want to say aggressive rock, but that's not the right word. Abrasive, challenging rock. That doesn't sound appealing either, but you get the point. Although the X have always been fiercely independent and outspokenly political, whereas Sonic Youth have been a little more coy, I guess, with their political statements. Certainly they have been political. That's not to say they aren't political, but their political statements aren't on the sleeve. You can also note Oral Gorilla as sort of a turning point for the X's career as well, because it starts to branch out into what Western music industry calls world music, but normal human beings just call music. A motorbike in Africa sort of evokes that sound in the song. Some polyrhythmic drumming, some very almost jazzy influences, but certainly African. Later, the X would travel to Ethiopia and work with Getachew Makuria in a partnership that in anyone else's hands might have seemed easily turned exploitative, but not for those Dutch punks. They dealt with it with putting both parties on an equal footing. And in fact, in many ways, the X became subservient to Getachew Makuria and his work, especially over the next 3-4 years as they solidified that relationship. The next set deals with cops, and it seems like UK cops in cars. So first, the Members with Police Car.
Police back in town, the streets
That set started off with The Members, a lesser-known band from the UK, but I think, underrated. The song, although this album, 1980, The Choice Is Yours, came out obviously in 1980, was a bit of softer than perhaps the earlier stuff that The Members did. I have played The Members before on the podcast, so go back a couple of episodes, search the release notes or the podcast notes, and have a look for The Members, because it shows you sort of the breadth of this band. And I guess that's the subtext of this whole episode, is that the bands that I'm playing have some breadth of ability, whether it's playing in punk style or others. Anyways, The Members never did get the same attention that some other bands of the same era did. Of course, they were a little more rock-oriented and pub rock feeling, but to me, I think that there's a little bit of, Stiff Little Fingers, where Stiff Little Fingers are, amazing, put out 3 really awesome records and then started diminishing returns. The Members put out 1 awesome record and then started with diminishing returns. Of course, they also honestly didn't last too long either. By this point, The Members were a band on the road towards a breakup. Of course, they later reformed. But I think that this album is still well worth picking up, because there are well played and catchy tunes. It's just kind of like, it feels a little limp. I will mention that they were also singing about social issues too. So it's not just they were certainly anti-racist and certainly very, very political in the time. I think the perfect way to describe it is that the rough edges were rounded off to make it a little more palatable for mainstream consumption. And I think that that's probably what happened with a whole swath of bands who were still playing in the early 80s that were, again, kind of like American bands in the mid 80s trying to become college rock. I think a lot of these bands from the late 70s, early 70s, mid 70s through to late 70s, if they were still playing in punk, they were, softened the edges a little to make it a little more palatable. Next up were Fiendens Music from Sweden with Snutbill, which is a direct translation of Police Car. And it's a direct cover of Police Car. What? Okay. Well, it's not the Members song. We'll get to that in a minute. Fiendens Music started as a cover band in the mid-70s, but were singing covers in Swedish, which was kind of an interesting take on Swedish nationalism at the time. There was a big movement in Sweden at the time to sort of get bands to be proud of being Swedish, and there was a big push from the sort of folkloric side of things, where bands would play folklore bands. And of course, teenagers are not often drawn to folk music as a rebellious thing. So Fiendens Music were very good at taking Western rock and roll and adding, whether it's a Swedish take on it or more of a contemporary Swedish view on Swedish music. Fiendens Music did actually play with a lot of early Swedish punk bands like Evergrön and Dagvag, but they themselves weren't punk. And in fact, you can hear that in the song. Punk in spirit, maybe prog rock, maybe a little pub rock. The sax is definitely a hallmark pub rock kind of move. So that leaves us with the third version of Police Car. And I thought this was an interesting tangent to go down, because the Larry Wallis version was next, and the original. Here's how it's loosely connected to punk, even though it's not very punk. It's kind of interesting in my head that Fiend End's music and the members picked up this song and covered it. I couldn't find any reason why those bands would pick this song particularly, except for maybe they had bought it on Stiff, heard it, and thought it was good. Larry Wallis is probably best known for his work in a band called the Pink Fairies. And if you are, kind of into punk rock from all eras, you'll know that Rollins' band covered Do It by the Pink Fairies. And if you've heard the original is actually a little bit better, in my opinion. But perfectly suited for a Henry Rollins kind of song, especially in the late 80s. There's another connection. Larry Wallis also was in the initial sort of pre-Motorhead band. He was the guitarist before Fast Eddie Clarke joined and solidified that first, trio attempt at Motorhead before Fast Eddie Clarke and Filthy Animal Taylor came around and made the real band. I'm really not sure how to classify the song. I've listened to it about 20 times now. It's not loud or rough enough to be called punk. It's got pub rock written all over it, but there's a weird sort of... If it was pub rock written by stoners, it's a neat bookend to tell the full tale of the song. And out of the three, I think the members did their version the best. It's most to my tastes. But let me know in the comments or in email or any number of ways what you think. Next up was The Abused. And no, not that one. This one's from Durham, England, and it's another notable band that came out of Durham was Voorhees, albeit about a decade later. This 1984 LP is a sort of a, I won't say a classic, but it's one by a band that is one and done. This is the only thing the band put out. The fact that it was an LP kind of makes me go, wow. And if you look on a map where Durham, England is, it's in the middle of kind of nowhere. So how did these four punks get together, get enough money, get enough knowledge and connections to make a record? Kind of blows my mind that punk is everywhere, and there's someone out there in the middle of nowhere with like three friends making an amazing record probably right now. So, as usual, I do a little bit of research on the internet, and there is nothing about this band other than they put out an LP. So if you know something about The Abused from Durham, England, by all means, write it in the comments of the podcast notes or somewhere else, and I'll add it to the next couple of podcasts somewhere down the line. Anyways, so yeah, The Abused. Short and sweet, kind of neat. But next up were the Subkids, or not the Subkids, Boots on Cars, which came out again in 84, but feels totally like 77. I'm not sure if the Subkids were French or Belgian. I'm thinking they're French, but this label that the 7-inch came out on was Belgian. Either way, this is kind of like perfect 77 style punk, except put out in 84, so it probably didn't hit anyone right at that time because we were all listening to, well, whatever came after Discharge. Apparently the band started in 1976, but didn't put anything out until the mid-80s, which makes me kind of go, this song is very clashy at points to the, good band, driving bass line, singer is going for a Joe Strummer kind of feel. Anyways, from 1984 to 1999 for the next set.
Double over,
I felt like one of those people who suddenly shaved their heads and said they'd always been punks. I was sure I'd be discovered at any second.
And it blows my fucking mind! What the fuck?
That set was slightly unusual for this podcast because it contained music from, well, around the turn of the decade. Actually, the turn of the century? Yeah, 1999 for two of those songs and 1996 for the third. First up, we're Tear It Up with Thrash Wagon, undoubtedly an ode to the touring that the band did and the vehicle that the band toured in. Tear It Up existed for a few hot minutes from 99 to I think like 2004. Put out a modern classic in Nothing to Nothing, toured their asses off, and then disintegrated. This song was from the December 2000 session CD, which I remember less than nothing about. The band put out like three things really quickly, and actually probably a couple of 7 inches in there too. I just remember getting the Nothing to Nothing LP and being floored with that. Tear It Up were pretty awesome both times I got to see them. I got to see them at a Toronto gig with an early version of Mental. I think it was their first out-of-town show from Boston. They were opening up for them. I thought Mental were terrible that day, and I actually think probably they're terrible. Certainly not to my taste. Two other smaller bands opening up for Tear It Up, Fucked Up and Career Suicide. It was a matinee show at the Rivoli in Toronto. So yeah, not a bad lineup. If you waited probably 2 more years after I saw that, that would have been like a $40 show. The other set that I saw was an absolutely killer set at Thrash Fest 3 in Minneapolis. I think that was 2002. Absolutely bonkers how good that set was, and in fact, every other set of the bands that were playing there. Of course, they broke up shortly thereafter, so, well. Somebody should be keeping Nothing to Nothing in print, if nothing else. After them were Deathreat, no, not the mosh metal band, but the good one, with 4 billion car pileup on the Information Superhighway, a bit of a cheat because this is not really about cars, but it has car in the title, so fuck it. I did get to see them in Austin in 1998 or so at a punk house where a dog had shit in what would later become the Pit. Prior to the Pit starting, of course. It wasn't a dog shitting in the middle of the pit while they played or something. That would be amazing, although terrible for the dog. The underrated Manchurian Candidate started the show, and it's pretty awesome to get to see Deathreat just annihilate the place with something like 30 people in the room. And that's got to be more than 20 years ago. Amazing. After them, I played Submachine, Suicide Drive. And I just got to see these guys for the first time last month. And they were so good, I went and saw them again the next day. Really cool, classic hardcore punk sounding. Sort of, again, kind of evoking a Poison Idea vibe, but maybe a little less hardcore and a little more punk. Wouldn't be out of place in the 80s. Probably old enough to be around since the 80s. I don't know if they're overlooked because they're from Pittsburgh or what the deal is, but they are worth seeing if they're in your neighborhood. Make sure you check them out. This song was from the Sawed Off Shot Glass anthology CD, which came out in 1998. And with that, that's it. I'm John Krutoff, and the podcast has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit the site General Admission at https://www.generaladmissionshow.com. That's a new address there, so don't go to Medium. If you go to Medium, should still see the stuff just a few days later. But hit up generaladmissionshow.com. That's where all the new stuff will be going. And if you're on Medium, you can read the Medium post about why we're not on Medium anymore. It just seemed, the short answer is, it just seemed more punk to actually do it yourself. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's GENADM Show, GenADM Show. If you're old, an email, generaladmissionshow@gmail.com. And if you didn't like this podcast, in the words of the amazing big boys, go start your own podcast. See you next month.